The Behemoth Brewing Company presents the Department of Conversation with Pat Brittenden. Behemoth, give me something hoppy.
So, Professor Justin O'Sullivan, thank you for joining us, and good morning to you.
Morning. How are you, Pat?
Yeah, good. Now, for people who don't know or are unaware, we're recording this on Monday morning, so is the football's just finished. And
Yeah, did you?
I was going to say, I'm sorry to plead ignorance, but is there UEFA?
I was the Euro Cup.
Euro Cup. And
Cup,
of course, we can put this out there now because this will be out there on Tuesday morning. England lost once again in penalties.
They did, unfortunately. Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm not. I respect every kind of people's ability in their sports and that kind of stuff, but I've never understood why that's called the beautiful game. You know that these two teams run around for, in that instance, 120 minutes, 2 hours, and they score one goal each. I think about that in other sports. Imagine a game of netball. You know, all those people run around for 40 minutes, whatever their game is, and it's 2-2 at the end of the whole game. I've never quite understood why it's considered so much the beautiful game. But
I mean, I watched a bit of it this morning. I enjoyed it, and I think the skill that they have is amazing. And it is an amazing game. It's like chess, I guess. In some ways, it's pretty cool. I actually enjoyed watching.
That's an interesting comparison. When you say test, you mean test cricket?
No, chess.
Oh, chess. You said. Sorry, I said test because I was going to say
it's a bit like chess. They're moving it around and they're looking for opening and closing, and I enjoyed it actually. I did.
I have to say, although what I've just said, I'm not deriding it. I'm just not a fan of football or soccer, whichever people choose to use. But there's nothing particularly there's nothing more particularly exciting than the penalty shootout. But also I feel like there's kind of nothing more pointless because when you get to that point, it is basically a coin toss. It's like I wonder if that's the conversation. And I'm not a purists out there are gonna hurl abuse at me, but it feels to me that two Titan teams that get to an end of a game after extra time and it's all drawn up should perhaps share something. I don't know. I mean, maybe that's not the done thing in this day and age. Maybe I'm showing my my feminine side a little bit by saying share, but be nice to each other because it seems at the end of it, if you toss a coin, it's a bit of doesn't do justice to perhaps the battle.
Yeah, I don't think it was a coin toss though. I think when you watch those penalties, the times when those keepers save the ball, it's pretty spectacular. And I think I feel for the players. Players, you can see them. And what it means to them when they miss or when the keeper saves it. It's pretty spectacular. But yeah. I
remember there was when how rugby can end in a draw, but when you do need a result, like if it's a qualifier or if it's a World Cup game, there actually is a point in the process you can get to a coin toss, because it's something like obviously the end of full time. If it's drawn, you go to extra time. But the end of extra time, if it's drawn, they do something like they go back to how many tries are scored. If that's drawn, they go into like a kickoff, like a penalty kickoff. If that's drawn, they go to a coin flip. There is a I can't remember exactly what it is, but there is a pattern where they literally do get to a point in a rugby game that there has to be a result where they do flip a coin to see who won, which seems ludicrous, but there you go.
Yeah, I think those games where it ends in a draw, they're pretty spectacular. Even that when it goes the extra time. Yeah.
Hey, listen. Thank you for joining us. You are a professor at Auckland University, and you were recently in Dunedin, and I saw your a public lecture that you were delivering, and we will see. Let me bring up the actual, even though it's past tense, so people don't get excited to go see it. Oh, my little mouse is giving me some trouble to move it closer to the thing. We'll bring it up for people who are watching. Playing the inheritance game, My Genes and Neurological Conditions. Now, that speaks to me of sort of, the world of nature versus nurture, the inheritance game, what we are delivered at birth versus what we do with our lives. Can you explain a bit to me about the idea of the inheritance game and what that means with the work you're doing as a professor at university?
Yeah, sure. So my group work on understanding how your DNA really links to the characteristics that you have and the sequence of your DNA. So we all have about 3 billion bases of DNA in our genome. So that's inside each one of your cells, well, except for your red blood cells. And so that information really is the instruction book that sort of guides the way we develop and our characteristics and the way they develop. But what it does is a whole lot of places throughout your DNA where we have changes that are different from each other. So between you and me, or me and anybody, there's about 3 million differences in our DNA sequence. And a whole lot of those occur in some of the proteins or the genes, that encode the proteins that basically are really essential for us to have. But there are other ones that occur in parts of the DNA that don't really encode genes or don't encode proteins. And those changes are really, really important, because what we think they do is they actually impact on these switches, and these switches that turn things on and turn things off. And we think that the characteristics or the patterns of those switches that you actually inherit, the ones that are working versus the ones that aren't, that really affects your risk of developing particular diseases or characteristics. So you can think about it like, you get a house and you buy a house, or you inherit a house from your mum and your dad, say. And in that house, some of the switches are broken, and when you go into the house and you go to turn the lights on or lights off, or heaters on and heaters off, because it's winter now, of course, that's what we're doing, right?
Yep.
So when you go in to do that, some parts of the house, the heaters don't work because the switches are broken. And so that there means that you live in a particular part of that house, or you don't have light in a particular part of that house. And so if you don't have light and heat, and those two things are separate, so that where you don't have light, you have heat, but where you don't have heat, you have light, where are you going to live? You're going to live in the part where you have light but no heat, or heat but no light. It really affects the way you are and the way you live. And you can think about your DNA a little bit like that, in that if you have these patterns of switches, some break different control, or these control elements, they break the way that certain genes work, and that affects the way your characteristics develop. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, I'm wondering as well. You talked about you talked about characteristics or diseases. I mean, I think about a characteristic being like my sister always laughs at me because she says I drive like my dad. That feels like a characteristic that I have. Whereas a disease might be like my even though it's apparently not, you can't pass it on in your genes. My mother passed away of motor neuron disease. That would feel like a disease. Are you talking about characteristics as in sort of what we do and feel and look and say and how we speak? Is that a characteristic, or are you still talking in the world of like sort of health and diseases when it comes to characteristics?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a good thing. I mean, I think a classic is eye color is a characteristic, right? And eye color we understand is inherited in a Mendelian fashion, right? That you get some dominant and recessive genes, and it's a combination of those that you get from your parents that basically determine your eye color. And in a very simplistic way, that seems to be right. I mean, that's what we teach in schools and things, right? But unfortunately, there's 256 degrees of freedom in the way eye color is inherited, right? There's a whole lot of different places and different parts of the genome that actually contribute to that. And a lot of those things that contribute to that are actually these non-coding switches, these bits of the DNA that aren't genes, but they are switches that control other genes. And they contribute an awful lot to that actual signal and how you inherit eye color. So I tend to talk about the characteristics I'm talking about are things, features like eye color, for example, or your chance of developing a disease, your risk. But you can, of course, inheritance is a complex thing, and we do inherit traits and things from our families and ways of doing things from our families and from people, which aren't necessarily genetically determined.
Yeah. So how I was also thinking as you were speaking, recessive genes. What is the recessive gene, and how does that work within this whole system? Like you see someone who has got. I mean, this is as you have to understand. You're talking to a Neanderthal, so as I understand, it might be completely wrong, but a recessive gene, like someone who all of a sudden pops out with red hair, who hasn't had that in like 3 or 4 generations of people, or something similar to that, and people go, "Oh, recessive genes."
Yeah, so that sort of dominant and recessive has been kind of defined since Mendel, right? So he was the monk who sort of crossed P's to understand the basic tenets of inheritance that we originally understood. And what he discovered was that some things are dominant over others, so that if you have this dominant gene or a dominant copy of a gene, or an allele is what it's called, if you have that dominant copy, then just having that means you will get that particular characteristic. Whereas the recessive one, you have to have 2 copies of a recessive allele in order to see the characteristic that will be. And so I don't know if red hair is one, but it may well be. But blue eyes definitely is one, right? And so the gene, you've got to have 2 copies of the gene or the allele that actually gives you blue in order to inherit blue eyes. If you have a brown or anything else, then brown will be dominant and you'll have brown eyes as opposed to blue. And so that's why sometimes you can have parents who have different eye colors, like green or brown or whatever, but then the child will have blue because blue is recessive.
I did this the other day, actually. I'm just reminded, as you're saying, we've got a border collie who's red.
Yeah.
Whose dad was red, but mum was black and red and white and black and white, and we went through this whole thing about she would have had to have had some red and white genes in her somewhere from her things for it to actually become a red puppy, even though she was black and white.
Yeah, in that color, in that instance, possibly. I think, I don't know much about how dog hair colors inherited, unfortunately, but yeah, possibly. There are some instances where some things are actually epigenetic as well. So and so in that instance, what happens is your environment actually contributes a signal, and that signal changes the way your DNA is read or your genes are read. And as a result of that, that can then be inherited. And it's a really neat mechanism, quite complicated, but it does affect the way things are seen and are manifested. Yeah.
We should probably also talk about what is a genome. I mean, if we just take one half step backwards, because you've mentioned that already today, and obviously that's a part of your research and part of your work. I mean, I sort of had the understanding that a genome was kind of all of the genetic information in an organism, like all of it together. But maybe you could explain to me, the Neanderthal, what actually is a genome, because we do hear that word a lot. I sometimes think about when you hear or see in the media conversations around things like this. People are like, the genome this or the, this, that, but they don't actually ever go, for the people who don't know, what is a genome?
Yeah, I mean, that's true. We talk about genomes for COVID and all sorts of things now, right? So the genome, as you said, that's quite a nice summary. The genome is all of the genetic material that's inside an organism, right? So inside the cell, if you're going to the cell level, a cell has its own genome, and an organism like COVID, that has a genome too, right? And it's all of the genetic material that's inside that organism, right? That determines the characteristics of that organism. And for us, we have multiple genomes, right? So actually, we have the genome that's inside our cells. And so inside about 20% of your cells, because 80% of red blood cells, they don't have a genome, they lose it as part of their development. But the rest of your cells, they do. In fact, they have 2 genomes. They have the genome that's ours, which is inside what we call the nucleus, which is a particular compartment of the cell that really separates that DNA away from all of the stuff that's going on in the rest of the cell, right? So it keeps it away from the other molecular functions that are happening, away from the energy production and all of that. Well, that genome, the human part, right? That has, the chromosomes that we have and 3 billion bases of DNA. But then we have these little organisms called mitochondria. Well, I call them an organism, but these organelles called mitochondria. And mitochondria, they make the energy and they metabolize a whole lot of stuff in our cells. And they used to be bacteria, right? And they live inside our cells now, just as part of us, right? And they have their own little genome, right? Which is actually a remnant of a bacterial genome. It's pretty cool. But that's part of our genome as well, right? So inside our cells, we have those 2 bits that make up really the genome of us. At the same time, we have a whole lot of microbes that live on us, right? A whole lot of bacteria and fungi and bacteria, viruses and all sorts of things, right? These viruses that attack bacteria. We have all of these things and they live on us as well, right? And they're a part of us, right? They've evolved with us. And they're really important for the way we work and function, our health, our well-being, and all of that, right? They all have their own little genome. Right. And so we have a much, much bigger genome. In fact, they have more genes than we do. And so it's really amazing, right? Because that part actually changes. That part of your genome is kind of plastic and it can change, right? It's not fixed. So over your lifetime, it changes depending on what you're doing. In terms of what you're eating and how you're living and all those sorts of things, that part of your genome, that microbial encoded part can actually change. And it's a really, really amazing thing. It's a really exciting thing. That's the microbiome, right? Is that part of your genome.
So again, that's like an external part. Like when you say about all the other, I'm thinking about me being in my own ecosystem now, with my stuff that I have to operate, but other things living with and on me as well. I think about I always remember when I was at school, a little kid freaking out with a magnifying glass of a mite that lived in my eyebrows. That's too small to see. Is that what you're talking about other things living on us with their own genome?
Yeah, we're a walking ecosystem, right?
Yeah.
So you're not a, oh, sorry, my phone just rang. That's terrible, isn't it? Obviously, yeah. Sorry, I'll just hang up. It was my mum, don't worry. I'll call her back later. So your microbiome, right, is it's an amazing thing, right? And it's not something to worry about or anything like that. It is a part of you, and it's essential for you to have one. And those organisms, they've evolved with us, they change with us, and they are really like 100% essential. Each one, as I said, has its own little genome. In fact, there are about 10 to the 13 cells, or 3 times 10 to the 13 cells in a person, right? And there are approximately that many bacteria that live on us at the same time. Most of them live in your large intestine. And yeah, like I said, there's actually about 10 to 1 in terms of how many genes they have and how many genes we have, because our genes are the ones inside our cells, right? Let's talk about it that way.
Yep.
Very simplistic.
Yep.
But we have about 24,000, 25,000 genes inside our little cells. And depending on how you define it, some people will say we've got about 50,000, but it's that sort of ballpark, right? So we have that many genes. These organisms, they have like 10 times as many, right? Because there's so many of them and they're all different and they all work together, and it's an amazing thing, yeah.
So the microbiome is like a complementary system that lives with us, but is not a part of us. Would that be right?
Yeah, that's how we think about it, yeah. Absolutely.
It makes me
it communicates with us, right? So it does all sorts of things, right? It modifies your immune system and the way your immune system works. It changes that. It's capable of like interacting with that and modifying your response to things, your immune. It makes products that actually come out like short chain fatty acids. Are like pre-digested energy molecules, right? These pre-digested energy things, they come out of the bacteria and they go into your system. They feed the cells in your intestine and they do all sorts of things, right? It makes some things that are actually precursors to some of the hormones that we actually use in our bodies, right? Amazing things that it does. It's incredible, yeah. And we don't even understand it fully.
Yeah.
Nowhere near.
Well, if you don't understand it fully, look at my glazed look. Not glazed. I'm taking the piss a little bit, but yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, once again, it's never thought about. The first time I've ever thought about me being a walking ecosystem. I mean, I've known that we have things living with us and on us, but actually, it sounds more like we're now. I mean, like a parasite or a virus in and of itself needs a host to survive. So we've got whatever these things are in the microbiome, I'm not calling them parasites or viruses, but that are with us and on us and in us that need us to survive, but also provide us a service. Like those little fish that swim under the sharks' mouths that clean up for them.
Yeah, it's a bit like that. Yeah, so they are more symbiotic than anything else, right? So they're communicating with us and they provide us with stuff that that some of them digest forms of starch and carbohydrate that we can't digest, right? And then from that we get the products as well, and they also feed their own communities. And so yeah, they are very, very important. In fact, if you can make mice, right, and you can take the mouse and breed the mouse in a sterile cage, like the buoy in the bubble sort of thing.
Yeah.
Where you can keep a mouse in a bubble like that. And when you do that, you can actually make them so that they are what they call not-abiotic, and they don't have any microbes living on them, so they're sterile.
Wow.
And if you look at these mice, right, they're not normal, right? They don't develop normally. They have a whole lot of characteristics that are really unusual. Their guts don't develop normally, and a whole lot of things that don't work. And that's because they don't have the bacteria. And they don't have these organisms living with them because that's what helps them develop. So they're really, really important for us as we grow and develop, right? they're a part of us. It's really cool.
So if you then went and got that mouse and basically just said, there you go play in the mouse hutch with all the other mice, it would be detrimental to it. It wouldn't be able to survive in that environment.
No, I don't think a mouse. I've never done that. I'm not allowed to. No, I don't think it would survive. Not the same way. No, I think it would have competition issues. But I don't know the answer to that. Yeah.
You talked before about COVID, and I thought because you are someone who works in and around chromosomes and DNA, I think we're okay in New Zealand for our understanding, or at least our trusting of the vaccine system. But I was thinking maybe you could explain to us, what mRNA vaccine is and how that affects us versus other. I'm sure you're up to speed with all of that and can give us a bit of a layman's terms on what we're looking at.
Yeah, look, I think that mRNA vaccine is amazing, and I can't wait to get one. Unfortunately, I'm down the queue, so I've got to wait quite a while. But I think they're amazing, and well, basically what it does is, in really, really simplistic terms, the mRNA is the messenger molecule that basically takes information from DNA and is read by the machinery that makes protein. And so what they've done is they've figured out a way to stabilize this mRNA, and then you can inject it inside these little vesicles, basically. It goes into the body and then it gets read. And so your body makes some of this protein, right? And what your body's doing is it's making some of this foreign protein. And the protein is one of the proteins from the virus. And it's really important because it does it temporarily, but what it does is it makes a bit of this protein, and then your body has never seen that protein before, right? So it reacts to the protein. And so it becomes immune because your antibodies form against and target that thing. So, this is not my area, but that's basically how it works. And it's beautiful because there's no risk. You're not using an inactivated virus. You're not using anything like that can possibly give you this horrible disease or illness. And so it's a really, really amazing thing. I think it's beautiful.
What's the difference between the mRNA vaccine, not even necessarily the COVID one, but in general, and my understanding, like my father in 1948 got polio. So he was in that wave, and that kind of more, I guess what I'd call as a layperson, a traditional vaccine, which appears to be sort of a dead version of the disease. So then the body fights back against what it is. Yeah,
that's basically what it is, right? So the more traditional things are inactivated or weakened versions of a virus, and so when you do that, there's always the possibility that some will get through, right? That some escapes. But with the mRNA vaccine, there's no possibility of that.
And is it that the mRNA, because of like the coding, it actually it sends messages in as to what to do, whereas the traditional one is more, here is the virus, your body better react to it. So it's almost like, I don't know. Yeah. It feels more like one's a computer program telling the body what to do, and the other is more of a physical thing making the body do something.
Yeah, they're both. Yeah. So, when you put the inactivated virus in, your body responds as normal, right? It responds to a foreign entity inside your body, and it goes, "Hey, this foreign, bang! I'm going to make antibodies. Going to do that, right?" And that's what it does. But that's the whole thing. When you put in the mRNA is the message that says, "This is how you make a protein," right? That's all it is. Just make a protein. Here you go. The mRNA lasts a certain amount of time, and then it gets degraded and it disappears. But it just basically says, "This is how I make a protein. Make this protein," and your body makes the protein, puts it out. But it's foreign. It's never been seen before. So your antibodies come in, they recognize it, or your cells recognize it as being foreign protein, and they destroy the protein, right? They start to make it up, cut it up into bits. They present it on their surfaces. They do all this stuff. Antibodies are made against that, and it becomes a foreign thing, right? Meantime, the mRNA has been degraded, goes away. So you make this really cool antibody system. It's a beautiful way to do it. Yeah, really beautiful. Very, very
the real beautiful game.
It is a real beautiful game. Yeah.
Hey, now that we've kind of gone through a bit what genomes are and all that sort of thing, jumping back to the inheritance game, is there a fairly? I'm thinking about, you know, people who have had things like parents who have had heart attacks in their 50s or heart disease, and the next generation being more susceptible to it. You know, my father had prostate cancer when he was 60. So even though in my 40s, when I go and get bloods, I always say, oh, let's get I think it's the PSA levels done as well, just for safety. Is that part of what we're looking at when we talk about DNA and inheritance and kind of between generations, looking at those sorts of things, looking out for diseases, looking for what we're going to inherit in the next generation, if anything, and those codings that can switch things on and off?
Yeah. So that's exactly it, right? So we all have all of these changes in our DNA, right? And they're spread everywhere. They're inside the genes and in these non-coding regions, or what people once upon a time called junk, right? It's a really bad term because it's not, and it was never meant that way. But outside of the DNA, outside of the genes, there are these switches and these changes, right? And everybody has a risk. It's just about risk, right? It's like, you know, you're going to a casino or something, the cards are stacked, you're playing, right? There's a risk of how you're going to go, right? And depending on how the cards are stacked, you know, you have more or less risk of losing. And I guess casinos, right, we normally lose, but everybody has that same thing, right? You have a whole hand that you've been dealt, and you have a risk of winning or losing, right? And really, the rest of it comes down to the environment, right? It's, if you, for example, we take that card analogy a little bit further. If you've got a set of cards, you got a pair or something, you can win, right? That's fine. But if you have cues that you're giving away what you've got in your hand in front of you with your face or raising your eyebrows or whatever tick you have, you know, then someone else can read that, and your chance of losing goes up, right? Because they figure out you're bluffing or you're doing whatever. It's the same deal with the changes in your DNA, right? They predispose you, and they give everybody a certain risk of winning or losing in terms of getting a particular characteristic or developing a disease. But you don't have to. It's not deterministic, right? It's not that, yes, you will get this. There are some conditions like cystic fibrosis or Huntington's, where when we get a particular mutation in a gene that is very highly penetrant, which means that you do have a very, very high risk of developing that disorder. But even then, it's not fixed, you know. And the environmental cues, they're the other thing that impact it, the way we live our lives, what we do, you know, what we eat and drink and exposed to in terms of chemicals, all of those things. Did that answer that question?
Yeah.
I think I went on a bit of a ramble there.
No, I'm also wondering about because it feels like the obvious sort of way to think about this from my side of things is what's in my DNA is my nature, but how I live is my nurture. So I'm not in the position where I had parents who had like heart attacks in their 50s or anything, but if you were, and you were predisposed, or you had a higher chance or probability of that happening to you, if you lived the incredibly healthy life, that might be one of the determining factors for you to have your nurture override the nature. Or is it that there are some things within the DNA that it doesn't matter what you do? Like I've got stories of, you know, friends of families and stuff, the healthiest guy in the world, you know, marathon runner sort of thing, and well, not even marathon runner, but just a runner, fit, healthy, you know, amazing genes, sons who are amazing athletes, went out for a jog on a, you know, Saturday afternoon, kind of late 50s, and just dropped dead there and then. Is there some DNA things you just can't avoid no matter what?
I think so we don't tend to think about it that there are things that are deterministic, right? Deterministic means that if you have this change, you absolutely get this, right? And I think, you know, there are studies that show that, you know, people can be walking around with mutations in genes that should give them childhood onset disease, lethal childhood onset disease. And they're walking around as adults and they're perfectly fit and healthy, right? And the reason that we think that happens is that there are things that can modify the way some of your genes work, right? So they're all working together in systems. And if you change part of that system, you can modify for the way the rest of the system works, right? And so we tend to think that they're working in terms of those modifiers, that you're turning things up and turning things down. Sometimes you can do that to compensate. Now, there are some disorders like cystic fibrosis and Huntington's where that's very rare that you can do that. But even there, there are points where we think you can sometimes, or some people seem to be able to anyway, and they have a system that basically compensates. So I don't tend to think that things are 100% deterministic, right? I think that what you do and the way you live and what you're exposed to, that can affect things. But clearly there are inherited disorders, and your risk goes up if your father had, for example, prostate cancer or whatever, then your risk of developing that does go up. And we know that very, very well, right? It's very, very clear. We've known it for a long time. So yes, genetic risk is there and it's real, but the environment also does impact on it. Yeah.
Often we talk about, not we, but there's a saying, and it's more to do with someone's, how the family or something someone's born into, and people say things like, there are people out there who, even though they think they've hit a home run in life, they don't acknowledge they started on third base. That's more often talking about, people who are privileged or who are set in a situation where they're set up to succeed rather than having sort of the world against them in some other situations. Is that the same with DNA and what's in it? Are there certain, even a group of people or a person or just an individual who's got like better DNA and they're, they're going to be the athlete or they're going to be the scientist because their DNA is already started on third base, for want of a better term, through what they've inherited from their lineage before them?
So I think, this is true. It's an interesting question, right? So basically, all of us are on a continuum. And we all represent variation in, people, size, height, weight, all of the characteristics that we see in people, intelligence, all of those things they're all on a continuum, right? That it's a variation continuum for people. And so as a population, we all see different features of this. Now, all of those characteristics, a lot of them, well, I'll say all of them, but there is a genetic component to that variation. And then there's that environmental component to that variation. And I think, that the outcomes are affected by both of those things. Sometimes, there are situations where you'll have a particular genome and that will limit your ability to be a sports person, for example. Maybe you have less short twitch fibers, so therefore you're not a sprinter. Maybe you have more long twitch fibers and you're a long distance runner. And those types of things, there is a genetic component to that, but there's also a strong environmental component.
It sounds like that I've asked a bit of a clunky question, and that there's a little bit of uncomfortability in the question. Is it that I've touched on, some people would say that, this group of people are better than that group of people? Have I touched on something? Because what I'm thinking is, is it more likely that smart parents have a smart kid? That's as deep as I'm sort of thinking. Or is it more likely that, a New Zealand silver fern netball player and an All Black rugby who get together are more likely to have a first 15 rugby player? That sort of inherited sort of things. But I'm interested is, did I touch on something that, taken in a certain direction, could be a really ugly conversation?
Well, I think,
not that I was intending on it, but was that the slight hesitation that you just kind of?
Well, yeah. I think that's true, right? Is that some people will use genetic or an understanding of genetics to justify certain things that I definitely don't agree with.
Yeah, of course.
And so it is part of the reason why I'm answering that way. But I think the examples where you gave there, clearly, if you have high performing sports people, they have characteristics, which they pass to their children, but they also have behaviors and things that they also pass to their children. And it's that combination of those things that would perhaps, and learnings that they've learned that they'll pass to their children, which would then perhaps put their children in a position to have better sports outcomes and those sorts of things. Yeah,
because that would be both. I think Todd Blackadder, the former All Black, his son has just started playing for the All Blacks, because not only would he have the DNA and perhaps that physicality passed on from his father, but his father coached the Crusaders, so his environment was also 100%, ensconced in rugby as well. So he possibly had both the nature and the nurture. I mean,
That's right.
another child of an All Black who, I mean, I don't know what Conrad Smith's children are doing, but after rugby, he's gone off to be a lawyer. So his world might be surrounded by more academia now. His kids might have the DNA of an All Black, but the nurture of go to university and get a degree and go and be an Oxford Fellow or something.
That's right. I think opportunity has a huge amount to do with what happens.
Which do you think has more? I mean, like the obvious question is, which is stronger, nature or nurture, either in your opinion or in your research?
Well, I think in terms of heritability for disorders, so heritability ranges sort of up to 40% for a lot of things, right? Which means that the environmental component is very, very strong. It's the other 60%, or maybe there's some missing heritability that we don't know, but largely I think it's of the order that a lot of things and studies in twins and things will actually show heritability for particular characteristics that go to sort of 40-odd%, and the rest of it seems to be environmental.
So 40-60. I mean, I know they probably can't quite say that like that, but that's right. What I hear.
Yeah, people, 40-60. Other people will say anywhere sort of 20-80, and those sorts of numbers. There's a lot of variation in the way people think about that and how people discuss that, even in the fields, where we work. And so, it's still not very well understood. And people talk about missing heritability and things like this, which are things that basically we don't understand. And so, anywhere from sort of 20-80 to 40-60, some people might even say the odd occasion it's 80-20, but it's clearly there, and it's a very, very strong component is the environment and the opportunity that comes.
That's amazing, isn't it? That the environment will play such a heavy part over our genetics. But I guess that makes sense. It's like if you tell a kid they're stupid for long enough, they end up believing they're stupid whether they are or not. They might be the son of a nuclear physicist, and you tell them they're stupid for long enough as a 4-year-old, then they grow up thinking that they're stupid. So I get it, or whatever. It's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it is.
Also goes to show the responsibility we have as parents.
Oh, it does. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Hey, stupid question time. I guess I want to ask. This is a stupid question. I love science fiction. I like X-Men. I've just rewatched all the X-Men movies over the past kind of 4 or 5 months, and
yep.
The famous thing about X-Men is there is a mutation within their genes that give people wild skills. I'm not asking you, can people fly? I'm not going quite that far. But are there mutations within DNA that give people advantages or disadvantages? Or, I mean, like being silly, has there been evidence showing where, 1,000 years from now, there could be mutations to human beings from what we see today, considering 1,000 years ago, or maybe 100,000 years ago, where human beings came from? We're very different species in what we can achieve. Is there such a thing as mutation that could bring a change to the human beings? Well, I don't want to say could we be superheroes, but science fiction versus real world when it comes to mutation and DNA. There you go. I'm asking that question.
I think there's definitely, we tend to think that we aren't evolving, and I think we're still evolving. Our societies are evolving. And I think that things won't change over time or over 1,000 years. I mean, I don't see how that's possible. I once heard somebody talk about the Y chromosome and how the Y chromosome is effectively disappearing. In 1 million years, the Y chromosome will be gone.
Really?
Because it's shrinking, and they had reasons for that, and other people disagree with their reasons for that. But it was a very interesting conversation. People got very sort of hit up about it. I don't really understand why. I mean, in 1 million years' time, those people wouldn't be there, right? So it doesn't really have any impact on them.
But if the Y chromosome disappear, female XX, male XY, wouldn't that mean there'd be no men?
Well, no, because you could be male X. You don't have to be XX. So there are other systems for determining sex and biological sex in organisms that exist already. X zeros, for example, all sorts of things. And so I think, there's no reason that you must maintain it. I think it does actually have mechanisms on it that people have come to understand that are actually trying to maintain the Y and keep it there. But clearly it's under pressure. And a lot of our sequences are under evolutionary pressure, and they're evolving and they're changing. over time. Would that make people superheroes? I don't know, mate. I don't think so. I don't think so. I can't see a mechanism whereby we shoot lasers from our eyes or something, but maybe there is. I have no idea.
Is there a future for things like manipulating DNA to, give us things like designer babies? Like we've seen movies, things like The Fifth Element, I think it is, where people are born with 12 fingers because they're going to be pianists, and there's a movie called Gattaca, I think it was a similar sort of idea. You could kind of program your baby before it was born to come out with certain characteristics and attributes. Now I know that's the massive far end of this hypothetical conversation, but is this something that we are going to see? People, you mentioned Down syndrome, people wanting to ensure that their children doesn't come out with Down syndrome, or people, I don't know, that people are going to tutu with the DNA before a baby is born to give them what they think is a perceived advantage.
I don't think. Look, I mean, people will try to do this. I don't think anybody understands the way it works. Some people will try, some people have. I don't think people accept it, and I don't think necessarily that we should accept it.
So you're saying it's unethical?
Well, I personally think it's unethical to do that. There are differences. I think when children are born and they're really sick, there are some instances there where we can actually target. And so there are some drugs that are doing this, and they use ASOs, so antisense oligos, artificial antisense oligos, and those oligos, they can target in to actually correct a mutation in the genome in those individuals, and they're doing that to promote well-being and health of the individual. In those instances, I think, I don't think enhancing people is the right thing to be trying to do, and I don't think anybody knows how to do that. That's where you have a mutation, a clear change, which is linked to a phenotype, which is linked to a disease, something that's extremely unpleasant, horrible for the individual and their family. And in those instances, they're being targeted to try and correct that change, and to make it so that child has a life which is productive and they have a life they should have, right?
So if it's unethical, and obviously you're the expert, I completely accept that's the position.
I'm not an expert on ethics.
Okay, so of the DNA. Okay, so that's your position, your thoughts, and I tend to agree with you, right? But thinking outside the circle, is it unethical in your opinion because of where it could lead? Because I mean, I'll use a silly example. If they could figure out a way, adjusting something antenatal or whatever to stop babies being born with holes in their hearts, that would seem to be a good thing, but that could also be a step towards designer babies.
I think it's a slippery slope, right? When you start to get into these things, and you think it's just a small change here, and then it's bigger change and bigger change and bigger change and bigger change, and it just gets worse and worse, and it's a very similar, So no, I mean, I think the best people to talk to about this sort of thing are ethicists. They think about this all the time. I work on the mechanics of how things work, so I'm passing on this. Yeah.
And so the mechanics of how that works is it's not happening now. People have tried, and they're. It sounds like what you're saying is because no one really understands it. What the mechanics of it are going to be incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to be able to do it anyway.
Well, no, the mechanics of it are not impossible to do, right? So, I mean, there's an example recently in Nature or Science that was published where they basically put in targeted an enzyme to break a gene, and in doing that, they degraded a product that was toxic, and that then cured the individuals from that disease. Now, that's a form of engineering that was done overseas, but it's not done before birth. It was done on an individual after birth, right? So it's done on people after birth. And I think there's a difference here that we're talking about, right? And so, they're quite, maybe some people think it's a subtle difference, but I think that's quite a major difference. It's not you're planning something, you're trying to address what is there in the individual, and you're doing it for the purpose of promoting health and well-being, as opposed to promoting some ethereal sort of characteristics that you think are better.
Yeah. Gosh, I mean, when you say it like that, you can see very clearly what the where that slippery slope could kick in. So,
well, you see where that slope goes, yeah.
Totally, because then you got the person who wants the All Black, who programs the genes to being that and that. Yeah.
And to be honest, I don't think that's possible. So, yeah.
Hey, Justin, is there anything you want to leave us with? Anything we've missed, or I want to make sure that we haven't kind of jumped into some areas that we have put out some information that you don't want to, that other people might use for nefarious reasons. I'm a bit of a dolt when it comes to conversations. I'm very open for any conversation, but I mean, sometimes questions and comments come out that may seem by some to be a little bit insensitive, and then I certainly don't want to be that in this area. Is there anything we need to clear? I should do this at the end of every podcast. My last question should always be, is there anything we need to clear up from this podcast? Is there anything we've put out there that could be taken the wrong way? Or is there anything you want to share with the people about what you do, what the work that you do, and all?
The human genome was sequenced in 2002, right? And the first one was published. And we've been learning a lot about it ever since then. And it's an accelerating rate of what we're learning, how it works and how it contributes to things, how it interacts with our environment, and how it interacts with the microbes that we have on us and those sorts of things. And I think there's a huge scope for really positive things coming out of this, in terms of
positive. Positive like what? What can come out of this that's positive?
Well, ways that we can treat disease and ways that we can address the things that are really impacting people now. And I think, that ability to treat disease, that ability to change mutations that are having a really negative impact on people, and to understand that, to begin to develop new treatments for Parkinson's or for multiple sclerosis or for motor neuron disease, those sorts of things, when we can start to do that, and we're starting to get to a point now where we're getting better ways of understanding what's actually happening in those disorders, those really horrific disorders that people get, and I think there we're starting to do this, and the potential is huge, and that's what drives me, and that's what we find amazing, is that potential to do that, to try and address those really horrible disorders.
So that to look at one of those examples you just gave of Parkinson's, I know that's mentioned in your research and your bios quite a bit. Do you study the genomes, the DNA of people with Parkinson's and kind of work backwards, or do you take samples of people without Parkinson's and then it's a case of which one of these people get Parkinson's to give you kind of their DNA makeup for what the DNA of someone with Parkinson's looks like?
So we study and we compare the genomes of people who have Parkinson's with genomes of people who don't. And by doing that, we can see changes that are associated with the risk of developing Parkinson's. And I think that's a really important thing, because when we do that, then we can understand what those variations are doing, right? Those changes are doing, and how that actually links to biological pathways that are changing in those people. And then we can understand how that interacts with the environment. And then we can understand, perhaps more importantly than the pathology of the disorder, which is, when you were diagnosed with Parkinson's, you have that pathology, right? Your neurons are starting to not work properly, and that's quite a long way down the track, right? But we're starting to understand things now that maybe are part of the way that you get to that point. That is the key, right? Because if you can start to understand the progression, how things shift, and how this disorder does, how your genetic risk or your genetics contribute to the risk of you actually developing the disorder over time. Mm-hmm. If you can figure that out, then what you can do is you can actually stop that progression. You can treat that progression. You can delay that progression. You think the difference, right, that it has if you were able to delay the progression to Parkinson's, so that you didn't develop Parkinson's when you were 70, but you developed it when you were 85. Right. And you had 15 more years of a productive, not productive, but of of a life that wasn't blighted by that Parkinson's, right? The impact on a person that would have, that's amazing, right? So those are the things that we're trying to do, right? That's where we're trying to get to, is the ability to do that for multiple sclerosis, do that for motor neuron disease, right? These degenerative disorders, if you can slow them, you can prolong people's, lives in a way that has really, really positive impacts, where the good years without that disease, right, are prolonged. That's an amazing possibility, I think. And I think that's really where this information's going. It's those sorts of things. That's what we're trying to do.
When you're studying these two groups of people, Parkinson's, not Parkinson's, are they the same age? So you get a comparison for that, and then do you ever see, or have you seen in the non-Parkinson's group, like signs that, oops, this person is probably going to develop shortly-ish? Like, have you seen the markers come up in the non-Parkinson's group that they may end up developing Parkinson's?
So there are people who come through as having high risk of having Parkinson's or developing Parkinson's. They have the genetic changes that indicate that perhaps they should develop Parkinson's, right? But they haven't, or they haven't displayed Parkinson's yet. Now, there's a couple of reasons for that, right? One reason is that maybe they have some other changes elsewhere in their DNA that are preventing them or reducing their chance of developing Parkinson's, which is something we want to know. Mm-hmm. Because if they have that, then maybe we can mimic that in other people by treating the enzyme that affects, or something else with a drug that promotes that state, or they've not been exposed to the environmental cues that have developed Parkinson's again, or that have contributed to developing Parkinson's again. That is something that we want to know, right? Because if we can work out what those cues are, and researchers can work out what those cues are, then perhaps it's something that's modifiable. Perhaps it's something in our environment that promotes this development of Parkinson's, or any other disease like that, for example. And if there is, maybe it's something that we can change.
And this research you've specifically done, like involving Parkinson's, I see you're at Massey University in 2004. Has this been going on for long enough, the research you're doing, for you to see, ironically, sadly, but the lifespan of people who were clear of Parkinson's, who had these signals that they were in high risk, but then they passed away of natural causes in the end? Have you been doing it for long enough to see that full cycle?
So I'm a data scientist, right? So we work with data that comes from other cohorts around the world.
Right, okay.
And so the other people that run these cohorts, they've been running them for a long time, some of them, and they have seen those sorts of things happen, I'm sure. We don't generally interact with patients. We use the data that comes from these big studies.
So not to undermine what you're doing, you're crunching numbers.
Yeah,
I'm not minimizing it, but that's what I'm saying. You don't have the patient in front of you. You're not taking the
no.
Yeah.
We crunch them.
And I know what you're saying is not this, but when you talk about expanding or extending, the lifespan, or certainly the time that people can live without Parkinson's, I'm reminded once again of my dad when he got prostate cancer. It was said to him then, in this day and age, people don't really die of prostate cancer, they die with it, because the medicine's got to a point where, as long as they get it early enough, people can still live they can live a healthy and full life, dealing with it rather than dying of it. And I don't know too much about kind of HIV AIDS these days, but it seems that people with HIV AIDS these days still live a pretty much a full life, and it's not like the 80s where it knocks people out in a very short time span. So it sounds like part of the research you're doing, and I'm not saying you're saying that people then won't get Parkinson's, but the expansion of life under whatever their normal is a really is a focus at the moment for what you're doing. As you say, like to go give them an extra 15 years of living without it rather than it kicking in earlier.
Yeah, that's what we're trying to do. Yeah, that's our goal, right? Is to try and understand how we can do that, how therapies can be developed that do that slow progression, that mean that basically, or even stop progression, right? So that, you don't develop it, that if there is a way to do that, that's our that's what we want to find if we can. I don't know whether it's possible or at all. It's always like a golden bullet, right? And I'm not sure that or a silver bullet, whatever you want to call it, but I'm not sure that it exists. But if we can find in those pathways that are changing, that are putting you at risk of developing this, we can find those targets that can basically be treated to slow that progression, to alter that trajectory of that disorder, then that is exactly what we're trying to do here.
Yeah, and I wonder as well, you say I wonder if it'll never be possible to have an exact answer, because as we talked about earlier in the podcast, with the microbiome we've got, and how all of us interact and our DNA might work slightly differently, it's not like, well, there's a cut on my arm, it needs stitches. It's a very, binary sort of solution. But with us being such advanced ecosystems, I wonder if there'll ever be one solution that'll work for everybody. I mean, it's a bit like we talked about vaccines earlier. It's a bit like vaccines. They say that the Pfizer vaccine is 94% effective against the common COVID, but I've seen recently they're talking about 64% against the Delta variant. It can't work for everybody. And I wonder if that'll always be the case with things like where your research is going, looking at things like Parkinson's and motor neuron disease.
Well, I think that's a slightly different example, but the COVID thing, the vaccine responses, but I think that medicine should be personalized, right?
Yeah.
It's everybody is different. Everyone's genetic makeup is different, and that puts you at risk in different ways. It puts, the way we respond to drugs is different between everybody, right? You don't all respond in exactly the same way to therapeutic drugs and those sorts of things. And I think, treating people as individuals, as you get a better understanding of their DNA and what that puts them at risk at and how it works and how things are changed in that person, these what we call complex diseases, which is what we're talking about here, right? These are complex diseases. They have many contributions from many small contributions from a lot of different changes in the DNA and the environment. And understanding those many changes and how they interact, that's the key. And if we can do that, then we can treat people as individuals the way they should be treated in a system like this. And that's when you get the real gains, right? Is when you actually start to do that. You treat people as individuals and you give them their own tailored therapies, basically.
What would be your, this is my last question for you. Thank you for joining us, Professor Justin O'Sullivan. What would be get to the end of your career, what would be sort of your looking back, that's my greatest achievement? That's my gold standard. That's the thing that I'm most proud of. What would you want to be able to do in your career to look back on and go, yeah, that was the one thing I am most proud of doing? So what are you trying to achieve, I guess is what I'm asking as well.
This is a good question, right? Everybody wants to make an impact, right? I think if there was just one impact that I could put my finger on that made a difference for people, right? That's what it is. Just one thing. I don't know what it is. I don't know whether it's maybe it'll be training somebody who is, or helping somebody develop through their career who's better than me and makes some outstanding finding. I mean, that would be an amazing impact. Maybe it's something that I managed, that the people that work with me and I managed to find that actually is put into application and actually makes an impact in health. Maybe it's setting up a system like a system that allows us to apply this type of thing to sequencing critically ill children and understanding them and making a difference in those children and their lives. I mean, it could be anything like that. I have absolutely no idea. It's just, we want to try and help people and their health, and the way they live. That's really it. I don't know. I can't say. I mean, I really hope that there is something that one day I can put my finger on and say, that was the thing that I think was best. But I have absolutely no idea.
Yeah.
What that will be, I am.
So it doesn't sound like you're trying to achieve something. Like there are some people who want to wipe out breast cancer. That's what they want to do, but you just want to affect a positive change with the research you're doing to a group of people for the future.
I want to affect a positive change through the research that we're doing. That's exactly what it is.
Nice.
That's
So at the end of your career, you can look back and go, I made a positive change, then you'll be happy.
I'll be a very happy man. Yeah, I will be.
Hey, Professor Justin O'Sullivan, thanks for joining us today. I'm sorry we missed you face to face in Dunedin, but I'm very glad we got a chance to catch up. I feel well educated in lots of areas. This is one of the podcasts I'm going to go back. Sometimes it's a bit weird. I don't know if you feel the same when you go and deliver a speech somewhere and it gets recorded. You don't watch it back yourself. It's a bit weird listening to yourself or watching yourself. But I think this is one that I'm going to go back and certainly have a look at again, because a lot has been said, and I think I need to mull over some of the little pearls you gave us to move forward and to continue on in life.
Thanks, Pat. It was nice talking to you.
Yeah, all the best, and congratulations to Italy again, I guess.
Yeah. Yes, congratulations to Italy.